Listen, Grandpa, why don't you stick to mopping floors and leave the real police work to actual detectives? Detective Bradley sneered when he caught the janitor examining evidence photos that had been left on a desk. The young detective was embarrassed that his high-profile murder case had gone unsolved for 3 weeks, and taking his frustration out on the elderly black custodian seemed like harmless fun. But Samuel Washington wasn't just any janitor, he was a retired detective with more solved cases than the entire current squad. And he was about to remind them what real detective work looked like. If you believe that wisdom and experience deserve respect, regardless of age or appearance, hit that subscribe button right now and tell us where you're watching from. Because this story will show you why you should never underestimate the power of a master who's still learning. The Metropolitan Police Department's detective division hummed with late-night activity. Computer screens glowed in the darkened office space, casting blue light across desks covered with case files, evidence photos, and empty coffee cups. It was 11:30 p.m. on a Thursday, and Detective Ryan Bradley was staring at the same crime scene photos he'd been analyzing for 3 weeks straight. Bradley, 28, was the youngest detective ever promoted in the department's history. Fresh out of his master's program in criminal justice, he had impressed his superiors with modern investigative techniques, technological expertise, and an aggressive approach to case work. But the Miller murder case was making him look like a fool, and his frustration was beginning to show. The case itself was complex. Amanda Miller, a 34-year-old accountant, had been found dead in her downtown apartment 3 weeks ago. The crime scene suggested a struggle, but there were inconsistencies that didn't fit any obvious motive. No signs of robbery, no evidence of sexual assault, no clear suspects, and alibis that checked out for everyone they'd investigated. The case was going cold, and Captain Rodriguez was asking daily for progress reports that Bradley couldn't provide. As Bradley spread the crime scene photos across his desk for the 100th time, he noticed movement in his peripheral vision. The night shift janitor, an elderly black man he'd seen around the building for months, was slowly making his way through the detective division with his cart of cleaning supplies. Samuel Washington, 67, had been working the night shift as a custodian for 8 months. To everyone in the building, he was just another invisible service worker, someone who emptied trash cans, mopped floors, and occasionally asked if they wanted their desk areas clean. He kept his head down, spoke softly when spoken to, and seemed like exactly what people expected from an elderly janitor. But Samuel Washington was far from ordinary. For 35 years, he had been one of the most respected detectives in the city, earning the nickname the Closer for his ability to solve cases that had stumped other investigators. His final clearance rate was 87% compared to the national average of 61% for homicide detectives. He had solved over 300 murder cases, trained dozens of young detectives who went on to become leaders in law enforcement, and developed investigative techniques that were still taught in police academies. Samuel had retired 2 years ago with full honors, but retirement hadn't suited him. He missed the intellectual challenge of detective work, the satisfaction of bringing justice to victims' families, and the mentorship opportunities with younger officers. When he learned that the MPD was hiring night shift custodial staff, he saw an opportunity to stay connected to law enforcement while observing how the new generation of detectives operated. What he had observed over the past 8 months troubled him deeply. Young detectives relied too heavily on technology and forensics, often missing basic investigative fundamentals that had solved cases for decades. They lacked patience, persistence, and the intuitive understanding of human nature that came only with experience. Most concerning, they showed little respect for the wisdom and knowledge of older officers, dismissing experience in favor of newer methods that weren't always better. As Samuel emptied the trash can near Bradley's desk, his eyes inevitably drifted to the crime scene photos spread across the workspace. In 8 months of cleaning the detective division, he had developed an understanding of the current caseload, and the Miller murder had caught his attention from the beginning. Samuel had seen similar crime scenes during his career, the staging that suggested one motive while hiding another, the evidence that seemed contradictory until you understood the killer's real psychology. But he had remained silent, observing how the young detectives approached the case and noting their mistakes. Tonight, however, something in the crime scene photos made Samuel pause. A detail that he'd noticed weeks ago, but that the young detectives had apparently missed, something that could crack the case wide open. Bradley, already frustrated by his lack of progress, noticed the janitor lingering over his desk longer than usual. "Is there a problem?" Bradley asked curtly, not looking up from his files. Samuel straightened up slowly, his years of law enforcement training telling him to be careful about how he proceeded. No sir, just cleaning around your workspace. Sorry if I'm in the way, but... As Samuel continued his cleaning, his eyes returned to the photos. The detail that had caught his attention was a reflection in a mirror in the background of one crime scene photo, something that revealed information about the killer's height and build that contradicted the current theory of the case. Bradley noticed Samuel's continued attention to the photos and felt his irritation spike. He was embarrassed about his lack of progress on the case, tired from 3 weeks of 12-hour days, and looking for someone to blame for his frustration. Hey, Bradley said sharply, causing Samuel to look up. What are you looking at? Samuel met his eyes calmly. Sorry, detective. I couldn't help but notice the photos. Terrible thing. What happened to that young woman? Bradley's expression hardened. The last thing he needed was some old janitor gawking at his crime scene evidence like it was entertainment. Listen, Grandpa, why don't you stick to mopping floors and leave the real police work to actual detectives? Bradley sneered, his voice loud enough to attract the attention of other officers working late in the division. Samuel felt the familiar sting of dismissive ageism that had become more common since his retirement. But he also saw an opportunity to perhaps help solve a case and teach a young detective about the value of experience. You're right, detective, Samuel said quietly. I apologize for overstepping. It's just that in my experience. Your experience? Bradley interrupted with a harsh laugh. What experience would that be? 30 years of emptying trash cans? Detective Maria Santos, working at a nearby desk, looked up with discomfort. She had always found the janitor to be polite and respectful, and Bradley's tone seemed unnecessarily cruel. Bradley, she said quietly, ease up. He's just doing his job. But Bradley was on a roll, his frustration finally finding a target. No, Santos, I want to hear about his vast experience in law enforcement. Maybe he can solve the case we've been working on for 3 weeks. Other detectives in the division had stopped their work to watch the confrontation. Samuel could feel their eyes on him, could sense their mixture of embarrassment at Bradley's behavior and curiosity about how the old janitor would respond. Samuel made a decision that would change everything. Actually, Detective Bradley, Samuel said, his voice taking on a different quality, more authoritative, more confident. I was going to mention that the reflection in the mirror in photo 7C shows the killer was approximately 5'6" and left-handed, which contradicts your current suspect profile. The comment hit the room like a thunderbolt. Bradley stared at Samuel in shock, while other detectives began examining their copies of the crime scene photos to check what the janitor had observed. How do you? Bradley began, then caught himself. What are you talking about? Samuel moved closer to the desk, his demeanor subtly shifting from that of a subservient janitor to something else entirely. The angle of the blood spatter on the victim's clothing, combined with the defensive wounds on her left arm, indicates the killer struck with their left hand. The reflection in the mirror shows a partial silhouette that, when you calculate the perspective distortion, reveals someone significantly shorter than your 6-foot suspect. Detective Santos rushed to her computer to pull up the photo Samuel had referenced. After studying it for several minutes, she looked up with amazement. He's right, she said quietly. How did we miss this? Bradley's face went through several emotions: confusion, embarrassment, and growing anger. Who are you? He demanded. Samuel Washington straightened to his full height, and suddenly the other detectives could see what they had missed for 8 months. The bearing of a man who had commanded respect in law enforcement, the confident stance of someone who had faced down killers and solved unsolvable cases, the quiet authority of a true professional. Detective Lieutenant Samuel Washington, retired. He said simply, 35 years with Metropolitan PD. They used to call me the Closer. But what this arrogant young detective didn't know was that he had just challenged a legend who was about to school the entire department. The silence that followed Samuel's revelation was profound. Every detective in the room knew the name. Samuel, the Closer, Washington. His cases were studied in police academies. His techniques were still used by veteran investigators, and his reputation was legendary among anyone who had worked homicide in the past 3 decades. Detective Santos was the first to recover from the shock. You're the Samuel Washington? The detective who solved the Riverside Strangler case. Samuel nodded modestly. Among others, Bradley felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. Not only had he just humiliated himself in front of his colleagues, but he had done it while disrespecting one of the most legendary detectives in the department's history. But you're a janitor, Bradley stammered. I'm a retired detective working as a janitor, Samuel corrected gently. There's a difference. I miss the work, miss the intellectual challenge. This seemed like a way to stay connected to law enforcement while observing how the next generation approaches investigation. Detective Martinez, a 15-year veteran who had heard stories about Samuel's legendary career, stepped forward. Sir, we had no idea. If you had known, you would have treated me differently, Samuel finished. But that's not the point. The point is that knowledge and experience don't disappear just because someone changes jobs or gets older. Samuel moved back to Bradley's desk and gestured to the crime scene photos. Detective Bradley, may I show you what I've observed about your case? Bradley, thoroughly humbled and desperate for any breakthrough, nodded silently. Samuel began to arrange the photos in a different order, his movements precise and purposeful. Your victim was an accountant, correct? Single, lived alone. No obvious enemies? That's right, Bradley replied, his defensive attitude replaced by genuine curiosity. The first mistake investigators often make is assuming this was a crime of passion or a random attack. But look at the staging. Samuel pointed to specific details in the photos. The overturned furniture is too neat, too deliberate. This was made to look like a struggle, but it was actually carefully arranged. He moved to another photo. The victim's computer was supposedly untouched, but notice the cable management. Someone familiar with technology reorganized these cables after searching the computer. They were looking for something specific. Detective Santos leaned in closer. Financial records. More than that, Samuel continued. Amanda Miller was an accountant who specialized in forensic accounting. She investigated financial crimes for law firms and corporations. Someone who was very careful, very organized, and very dangerous, hired her to investigate something, then killed her when she found it. Samuel pulled out his phone and showed them a news article he had looked up weeks earlier. 3 days before her murder, Amanda Miller filed a report with the SEC about irregularities in the pension fund of Hartwell Construction Company. The report alleged embezzlement of over $2.3 million. The room buzzed with excitement as the detectives realized they had been investigating entirely the wrong angle. The killer wasn't someone from her personal life, Samuel explained. It was someone who stood to lose everything if her investigation became public. Someone with access to financial records. Someone who knew her work schedule. Someone who could plan this carefully. Bradley stared at the photos with new understanding. David Hartwell, the company's CFO. He had the access, the motive, and he grabbed his computer to check their suspect database. He's 5'6" and left-handed. When Samuel revealed his true identity and started solving the case, the entire squad realized they had been working alongside a master. Over the next hour, Samuel walked the detective team through a masterclass in investigative technique. He showed them how to read crime scenes, not just for physical evidence, but for psychological insights into the killer's mindset. He demonstrated interview techniques that could reveal deception, and he explained how to connect seemingly unrelated facts into a coherent theory of the crime. Modern technology is powerful, Samuel explained as he guided them through the case reconstruction, but it's just a tool. The real work of investigation is understanding human nature, following logical connections, and asking the right questions. Bradley, who had been silent for most of the demonstration, finally spoke up. Sir, I owe you an apology. What I said earlier was completely out of line. Samuel looked at the young detective with understanding rather than anger. Detective Bradley, you're not the first young officer to assume that age equals irrelevance, but you're intelligent enough to learn from this experience. How did you know all of this about the Miller case? Detective Martinez asked. Samuel smiled slightly. I've been cleaning this office for 8 months. I've observed how you work, what you miss, what you focus on. This case reminded me of similar cases from my career, so I did some research on my own time. Research that solved the case, Santos pointed out. Research that provided a new direction, Samuel corrected. You still have to build the evidence, conduct the interviews, and make the arrest. But now, you know where to look. Detective Bradley stood up and extended his hand to Samuel. Sir, would you consider consulting on this case officially? We could really use your guidance. Samuel shook the young detective's hand warmly. I'd be honored to help, but I have one condition. What's that? When we solve this case, and we will solve it, you take the credit. I'm retired. My reward is seeing good police work done correctly. Over the next week, the detective team worked with Samuel to build a case against David Hartwell. Using Samuel's insights about the financial motive and the staged crime scene, they were able to obtain search warrants for Hartwell's financial records and computer files. The evidence they uncovered was overwhelming. Hartwell had been embezzling money from the company pension fund for over 2 years, using sophisticated accounting tricks to hide the theft. When Amanda Miller's investigation threatened to expose him, he had carefully planned her murder to look like a random crime. Samuel's analysis of the crime scene evidence proved to be exactly right. Hartwell was left-handed, 5'6", and had the technical knowledge to stage the scene and access the victim's computer. When confronted with the evidence, he confessed to the murder, but Samuel's impact on the detective division went far beyond solving one case. His respectful mentorship of the younger detectives, combined with his obvious expertise, began to change the culture of the department. Detective Bradley, in particular, was transformed by the experience. He began seeking out the advice of veteran officers, studying cold cases to learn from past investigations, and developing a more thoughtful, patient approach to detective work. What happened next would become legendary in police circles, a masterclass in detective work that changed how everyone saw experience versus youth. Captain Rodriguez called Samuel into his office the day after Hartwell's arrest. "Detective Washington," he began. "I understand you've been working here as a janitor for 8 months. That's correct, Captain. And in that time, you solved a case that had stumped my entire detective division." Samuel shifted uncomfortably. "I provided some guidance, Captain. Detective Bradley and his team did the real work." Captain Rodriguez leaned back in his chair. "Samuel, I've been thinking about this department's mentorship programs. We have a lot of young detectives with excellent technical training, but limited real-world experience. We also have a lot of retired detectives with decades of knowledge who aren't sharing it with the next generation. Are you offering me a job, Captain? I'm offering you a position as a consultant and trainer. Help us bridge the gap between the old ways and the new ways. Teach these young detectives what you can't learn in a textbook." Samuel considered the offer carefully. "I'd want to continue working nights sometimes. There's something valuable about observing how people work when they think no one important is watching." Captain Rodriguez smiled. "I think we can arrange that." 6 months later, Detective Bradley stood before a room full of rookie detectives at the police academy, delivering a lecture titled "Learning from Experience: The Value of Veteran Knowledge in Modern Investigation." Months ago, Bradley began. "I knew everything about detective work. I had a master's degree, the latest training, and all the confidence in the world. Then I met a janitor who taught me that wisdom and experience are more valuable than any technology or formal education." He clicked to a slide showing the solved Miller case. "This case taught me that every person you encounter in law enforcement, whether they're a rookie or a veteran, whether they're a detective or a custodian, has something valuable to teach you, if you're humble enough to listen." Samuel Washington watched from the back of the room, proud of how far his young protege had come. The arrogant detective who had once dismissed him as "Grandpa" had become one of the department's most thoughtful and successful investigators. The lesson Samuel taught that night about respect, experience, and real detective work would transform the entire department's culture. The Metropolitan Police Department's new mentorship program paired every young detective with a retired veteran for their first 2 years on the job. The program, known informally as the Washington Protocol, became a model for police departments across the country. Samuel's story spread throughout law enforcement circles, not as a tale of a young detective's humiliation, but as an example of how experience and youth could work together to achieve excellence. Police academies began using the Miller case as a teaching tool, showing how different investigative approaches could complement each other. Detective Bradley, now a sergeant, often told the story of his encounter with Samuel Washington to new officers. But he always emphasized the same lesson: the moment you think you have nothing left to learn from someone, especially someone older or different from you, is the moment you stop being an effective police officer. Samuel continued working as a consultant and trainer for 3 more years before finally retiring for good. His legacy, however, lived on in the dozens of young detectives he had mentored and the cultural change he had helped create in the department. The Miller case was solved, but the real victory was the lesson learned about respect, experience, and the value of every person's contribution to the pursuit of justice. In a profession where ego and hierarchy could sometimes overshadow effective police work, Samuel Washington had reminded everyone that wisdom came in many forms, and that the best investigators were those humble enough to learn from anyone with something valuable to teach. Years later, when Detective Bradley had become Captain Bradley, he kept a photo on his desk from the night Samuel had helped solve the Miller case. It showed the elderly janitor explaining evidence to a room full of detectives, demonstrating that sometimes the most important lessons come from the most unexpected teachers. The inscription on the photo read, "Real detective work isn't about proving how smart you are. It's about being smart enough to learn from everyone around you." And in the janitor's closet that Samuel had used for 8 months, a small plaque was installed that read, "Detective Lieutenant Samuel, the Closer Washington. Proof that wisdom never retires. It just changes uniforms." Where are you watching this video from? Don't forget to leave a comment with your city. Remember, every comment is a voice, and every voice is a change. What about you? Have you ever encountered such an event or situation? Write a comment. We want to hear your story.